I took care of my grandmother every day for a decade, while my relatives ignored her. Then they appeared at the reading of the will demanding their fair share. What Grandma left behind shocked all of us. I was 20 when I moved into my grandmother's house, and everyone acted like I had lost my mind because the place was old, Grandma needed help with basically everything, and none of my relatives wanted anything to do with it. Meanwhile, they all had opinions from the comfort of their own homes, which was honestly impressive, because some of them couldn't even remember Grandma's birthday, but somehow always had advice to give me about how I should be taking care of her. My Aunt Melissa was the worst for that, because every few months she would call, talk for 5 minutes, say something like, "You should really make sure she's eating healthier," then disappear again for another season like a side character getting written off a TV show, and my cousins weren't. Much better, years would go by without visits. Sometimes Grandma would sit by the window around holidays waiting to see if anyone showed up, and I'd pretend not to notice because it made both of us sad. But she always tried to make excuses for them, saying they were busy or stressed or had kids to take care of, and maybe some of that was true. But after 10 years, there are only so many excuses you can make before it starts sounding ridiculous. And during those 10 years, I was the one driving her to appointments, picking up groceries, helping with bills, cleaning the house, fixing random stuff when it broke, sitting with her when she couldn't sleep, and just generally being there while everybody else treated her like an old photo they forgot was hanging on the wall. Then about 3 years before she passed away, things started getting harder because her health took a turn. Not some dramatic movie scene, just one problem after another piling up until everyday life became exhausting. And I remember one night when I was helping her into bed, she grabbed my hand and said she didn't know what she would have done without me. And honestly, I almost cried because I was tired all the time. And hearing that somehow made me realize how alone she'd been before I moved in. But that wasn't even the worst part, because the second relatives heard she was getting worse. People who hadn't visited in forever suddenly started remembering she existed. At first it was phone calls, then random visits. And if you're already thinking they came back because they cared, trust me, I wanted to believe that too. But the timing was way too suspicious. My cousin Derek showed up after nearly 4 years of silence carrying grocery store flowers that still had the price tag on them, sat at Grandma's table, asked how she was doing, then somehow turned the conversation toward her finances within 20 minutes. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it was something about making sure everything is organized. And Grandma just gave me this look across the table that said she knew exactly what was happening. After that, it got worse. Melissa started visiting twice a month, which was more than she'd visited in the previous decade combined. And every visit felt weird. She'd bring baked goods, act overly sweet, then ask questions about the house, the savings account, the insurance policy, things that had absolutely nothing to do with Grandma's actual well-being. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and heard Melissa telling Grandma that family should always stick together and share things fairly. And Grandma looked confused because nobody had even been talking about inheritance. Meanwhile, I was standing there wondering where all this family spirit had been when I was cleaning up after Grandma got sick at 2 in the morning. Things stayed tense for months, and there were little arguments constantly. Nothing huge at first, just passive-aggressive comments, weird accusations, people acting like I was somehow controlling Grandma because I lived there, which was insane because half these people barely knew what medication she was taking. Then one Sunday, everything kind of exploded. Several relatives showed up for dinner at the same time, and I honestly think they were trying to impress Grandma, because suddenly everyone was competing for most loving family member of the year, and it would have been funny if it wasn't so embarrassing. Derek was telling stories about how much Grandma meant to him, Melissa was talking about family traditions, another cousin kept offering to help with things he'd never once helped with before. And then Grandma casually asked who had visited her last birthday. The room got quiet immediately, complete silence because nobody knew the answer, and that's because nobody had been there except me. And I swear the awkwardness was so intense you could practically taste it. One cousin tried changing the subject, another started looking at their phone, and Grandma just nodded like she'd gotten the answer she already knew. After everyone left, there was a huge group chat argument that lasted 2 straight days because people started blaming each other for not being involved enough. Old grudges came flying out, cousins exposed cousins, siblings exposed siblings. One person brought up money somebody borrowed years ago, another person accused someone else of only showing up because they wanted the house. And honestly, it was chaos. But I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong, because a few months later, Grandma's condition got significantly worse, and suddenly the same relatives who couldn't agree on anything were all trying to insert themselves into every decision. And that's when things started getting bad. Really bad. Because for the first time, people stopped pretending and started openly fighting about what they thought they deserved, even though Grandma was still alive. And one argument in particular changed everything because it happened right in front of Grandma herself. And what one of my relatives said that day left the entire room staring at them in shock. The argument started over something completely stupid, which is honestly how most family disasters begin. Grandma was sitting in her favorite chair while I was helping her sort through some mail, and my Aunt Melissa had stopped by again. Except this time, she brought Derek with her, and right away the mood felt off because they weren't acting like people visiting a sick relative. They were acting like people showing up to a meeting. And after about 15 minutes of awkward small talk, Melissa suddenly started asking questions about whether Grandma had everything squared away and whether certain decisions had been made yet. And I remember staring at her because Grandma was literally sitting right there listening. To all of this, then Derek jumped in talking about how family needed transparency and how nobody should be left out. And Grandma asked, left out of what? And the silence after that was brutal because nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone knew exactly what they meant. Then Melissa made the mistake that changed everything. She said something like, "We just don't want one person influencing everything," while looking directly at me, and for a second I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. But then she doubled down and started implying that because I lived with Grandma, I somehow had unfair influence over her decisions, and that was rich coming from someone who practically treated Grandma like a seasonal decoration until she thought money might be involved. I don't remember every word after that, because everything kind of blurred together. But voices got louder fast. Derek accused me of isolating Grandma. I asked him how someone can isolate a person from relatives who never visit. Another cousin who had randomly shown up halfway through tried defending Melissa. Then somebody else brought up how none of them had helped pay for anything over the years, and suddenly everyone was yelling over each other while Grandma just sat there looking exhausted. Then Grandma slammed her hand down on the armrest and the entire room went quiet. Not because she screamed, but because she almost never raised her voice, and she looked around the room and asked a question nobody could answer. She asked who had taken her to the hospital when she fell 2 winters earlier. Nobody answered. Then she asked who stayed overnight when she was scared after a medical procedure. Nobody answered again. Then she asked who came every Christmas morning for the last 10 years. And once again nobody answered because they knew exactly where this was going. Then Grandma pointed at me and said, "She did, and I swear you could see some people physically getting angry because they hated hearing it out loud." After that, Melissa got emotional and started talking about how family relationships are complicated and how people have lives and responsibilities, which would have been fair if she hadn't spent years posting vacation photos while claiming she was too busy to visit. And that's when another cousin completely turned on her and said everyone knew she only started showing up when she thought there might be an inheritance. And just like that, the relatives started attacking each other instead of me. Secrets came flying out left and right. One cousin admitted Melissa had been calling people for months trying to figure out what Grandma's assets were worth. Another relative exposed Derek for asking a neighbor whether the house was paid off. And watching them all throw each other under the bus was honestly wild, because these were the same people who kept talking about family unity. Then Melissa got embarrassed and stormed out. Derek followed her, and for a few minutes the house was finally quiet again. But the damage was done, because after that day nobody even tried pretending their visits were about Grandma. They called more often, they showed up more frequently, and every conversation somehow circled back to money, property, fairness, or what Grandma would have wanted. And the craziest part was Grandma noticed all of it. She wasn't clueless. She knew exactly what was happening. One night while we were watching TV, she laughed and said she hadn't been this popular in 20 years. And the way she said it was funny, but also kind of sad, because we both knew why people were suddenly interested. Then a few months later, her health declined again, and everything got more serious. Relatives started acting like they had authority over decisions they hadn't been involved in before. People argued in hospital waiting rooms, people argued in parking lots, people argued through text messages at 3 in the morning. Relationships inside the family started falling apart completely. One cousin stopped speaking to another. Melissa and Derek got into a fight over something involving money that I still don't fully understand, and meanwhile Grandma was just tired of all of it. Then one afternoon she asked me to sit with her because she wanted to talk. And I thought it was going to be another normal conversation, but it wasn't, because she told me she had recently met with her attorney and made a few final decisions. Then she smiled and said she hoped everyone enjoyed the surprises. And before I could ask what she meant, she changed the subject completely. And I didn't think much about it at the time. But looking back now, that was probably the moment she already knew exactly what was going to happen after she was gone. And when the day finally came and we lost her, I thought the fighting would stop long enough for people to grieve, but I underestimated just how ugly some relatives were willing to get, because less than 48 hours after the funeral, somebody started a family argument so outrageous that half the room nearly walked out. Less than 48 hours after the funeral, several relatives gathered at a restaurant after the service, and I honestly thought everyone would at least pretend to be respectful for a few days. But apparently that was asking too much, because before people had even finished eating, Derek started talking about the future of Grandma's house, and the second he said it, the entire table went quiet. Then Melissa jumped in and started saying family needed to stay calm and reasonable when discussing assets. And I remember just staring at them because Grandma hadn't even been gone for 2 full days yet. Meanwhile, some relatives looked uncomfortable while others looked way too interested. And then one cousin asked the question everyone had been thinking, which was how exactly they knew there would even be anything significant to divide up. And suddenly people started talking over each other again. Accusations started flying. Somebody claimed Melissa had already been making plans for what she'd do with her share. Melissa denied it. Another cousin said Derek had literally been discussing property values before the funeral. Derek denied that too. Then somebody pulled up old text messages in the family group chat and everything exploded, because now people were exposing each other in real time right there at the table. One relative accused another of disappearing for years. Another brought up unpaid loans. Somebody else started listing every holiday they skipped. And at one point a waitress walked by, looked at our table, and immediately turned around because she clearly wanted no part of whatever disaster was happening. Honestly, it would have been funny if it wasn't my family. Then Melissa stood up and started talking about how everyone was grieving differently and how people needed to stop attacking each other. And for about 5 seconds I thought she was trying to calm things down, but then she added that everyone deserved an equal share no matter what. And that restarted the entire fight all over again, because several relatives immediately asked what exactly they had done to deserve an equal share after being absent for years, and nobody had a good answer. Then one cousin actually laughed and said, "You all ignored her until she got sick, and now you're acting like shareholders at a company meeting." And I swear half the table looked ready to throw hands after that. Eventually people stormed out in different directions and the whole thing ended with everyone angry at everyone else. But I wish the story stopped there, because the days leading up to the will reading somehow got even worse. Relatives started calling me, constantly asking questions I couldn't answer. Some were trying to be subtle while others weren't even trying anymore. One person straight up asked me how much money Grandma had left behind. Another asked whether the house would be sold. Somebody else wanted to know if I planned on sharing fairly, which was interesting, considering nobody knew what the will even said yet. And then rumors started spreading. One relative claimed Grandma had left everything to charity. Another claimed she'd divided everything equally. Another was convinced she'd left the house to multiple people. and everybody was acting like they already owned property they hadn't even inherited yet. Then came the day of the reading, and the atmosphere was so awkward. It felt like everyone was waiting for a reality show reunion episode to start. People who hadn't spoken in months were suddenly sitting in the same room pretending to be polite. Melissa was acting confident. Derek looked smug. A few cousins seemed nervous, and I mostly just wanted the whole thing over with. Then before the attorney even started, another argument broke out in the waiting area because one cousin made a comment about people suddenly becoming devoted grandchildren overnight. And somehow that turned into a shouting match between 3 different branches of the family. At one point, someone yelled that Melissa had spent more time talking about Grandma's house than Grandma herself. And the look on Melissa's face was priceless. Then everybody got called into the room and things finally settled down enough for the reading to begin. The attorney started with a few smaller gifts and personal items, which already caused tension because people were reading into every little detail. Then some charitable donations were mentioned and a few relatives exchanged nervous looks, and the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable certain people became, because what they expected wasn't matching reality. Then the attorney reached a section that made several heads snap up immediately. It involved the house, and suddenly every person who had been pretending not to care looked completely locked in. Derek actually leaned forward in his chair. Melissa looked like she was holding her breath, and the room became so quiet you could hear people shifting in their seats. Then the attorney paused for a moment before continuing, and what he read next caused absolute chaos because Grandma had left behind something none of us expected. Something that instantly changed the mood in the room and exposed exactly how little some relatives truly knew about her. The attorney looked down at the paperwork and started reading the section about the house, and everyone was so focused you could practically feel the tension in the room. Because for years, half these people had acted like Grandma's house was the grand prize at the end of some competition none of them had actually participated in. Then the attorney explained that the house was not being divided between multiple relatives. And immediately I saw Melissa's face change. Derek, too. Then he continued and said the house had been left entirely to me, and for about 3 seconds nobody reacted because I think everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. Then all hell broke loose. Melissa stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over and started arguing before the attorney had even finished. Reading, Derek immediately demanded to know how that was fair. Another cousin started talking at the same time. People were interrupting each other. Voices were rising, and the attorney kept trying to continue while nobody listened. Then someone yelled that Grandma had been manipulated, which made several other relatives start arguing with them, and everything kind of blurred after that because there were so many people talking at once. But that wasn't even the biggest surprise because the attorney eventually got everyone to quiet down and explained there was more. Then he read a statement Grandma had personally included with the will, and suddenly the room got quiet again because hearing Grandma's actual words hit differently. She wrote that she was grateful for everyone in the family, but that gratitude wasn't the same thing as trust. She wrote that the person who consistently showed up during the hardest years was me, and that she made her decisions based on actions rather than promises, and I swear some people looked like they wanted the floor to open up and swallow them. But Grandma still wasn't finished, because she had also left specific personal gifts to different relatives, and every single gift had a reason behind it. One cousin got an old photo album because he was one of the few who occasionally visited. Another received family heirlooms, because Grandma knew they genuinely cared about family history. But when Melissa's turn came, the entire room froze, because Grandma left her a calendar. Literally a calendar, and attached to it was a note saying she hoped it would help her find time to visit the people she claimed to love, and the second that was read aloud I heard someone choke trying not to laugh. Then another cousin completely lost it and started laughing anyway, which made Melissa furious, and before she could respond, Derek's gift got announced, a framed photo of Grandma sitting alone on one of the birthdays he forgot, along with a note thanking him for finally remembering to visit during the last year, and the room absolutely exploded. People were trying not to laugh, other people were horrified. Melissa was yelling, Derek was demanding to know if this was some kind of joke, and the attorney calmly explained that those were Grandma's instructions, not his. Then the family started turning on itself again, except this time there was nowhere to hide, because Grandma had basically called people out from beyond the grave without ever raising her voice. Cousins started bringing up old excuses. Siblings started exposing each other's lies. One relative admitted they'd always suspected Melissa only cared about the inheritance. Another admitted Derek had spent months trying to figure out the value of the property, and suddenly years of resentment came pouring out all at once. Then Melissa made a huge mistake. She pointed at me and claimed I didn't deserve any of it because I benefited from living with Grandma, and before I could even respond, another cousin snapped back and asked whether helping an elderly woman every single day for 10 years counted as benefiting now. Then somebody else joined in. Then another person, and for the first time ever, people weren't attacking me. They were attacking the relatives who had spent years disappearing, and Melissa looked completely stunned because I don't think she expected the room to turn against her. Then things got even more awkward when one of her own children quietly admitted they hadn't seen Grandma much growing up because Melissa never wanted to make the trip. And the silence after that was brutal, because nobody could argue with it. Eventually people started leaving one by one. Some angry, some embarrassed, some looking like they had just realized how badly they had misjudged the situation. And while the fighting didn't magically disappear, something definitely changed that day, because the illusion finally broke. Nobody could keep pretending they had been devoted family members when Grandma herself had left behind proof of who was actually there. And as I walked out of the building with the will finally settled, I thought the worst was over. But a few weeks later I learned that losing the inheritance wasn't what upset certain relatives the most. It was the fact that everyone now knew exactly why they lost it, and that led to one final family meltdown that nobody saw coming. A few weeks after the will reading, I thought things would finally settle into something normal again, like maybe the family would cool off and stop acting like everything was still up for debate. But instead, it kind of split everyone into two groups, the people who accepted what happened and the people who still couldn't let it go. And honestly, the second group was way louder. Melissa was basically telling anyone who would listen that the will reading didn't reflect reality, which is crazy to say about a legal document that literally reflects reality. And Derek was going around acting like he had just been blindsided when in reality he just didn't like the outcome. Meanwhile, I stayed mostly out of it because there was nothing left to argue about. Grandma had made her decisions, and the attorney had read them out loud in front of everyone. End of story. At least that's what I thought. Until something happened that nobody in the family saw coming. Because about a month later, I got a call from the attorney asking me to come in again. And the way he said it immediately made my stomach drop. Not because it sounded bad, but because it sounded final in a different way, like something had been left unfinished. When I got there, he didn't waste time with small talk. He just slid a sealed envelope across the desk and said Grandma had added something after the original will was signed. And that alone made my brain go blank for a second because I didn't even know that was possible at that point. Then he told me she had requested it be opened only after everything else had been settled, including any disputes. And apparently that moment had officially arrived. I remember sitting there just staring at the envelope because it had her handwriting on it. And for a second, I almost didn't want to open it, but I did. And inside wasn't money, wasn't property, wasn't anything anyone had been fighting over. It was a letter, just a single page. And the second I started reading it, I had to stop, because it felt like she was sitting right there talking to me. She wrote that she already knew what would happen after she was gone. She said families always reveal their true priorities when something is on the line. And then she said something that made my chest tighten. She said she wasn't leaving me the house because I won anything. She was leaving it to me because I never treated taking care of her like a burden that needed to be rewarded, and that hit harder than anything from the will reading. But that wasn't even the part that caused the real chaos later, because at the bottom of the letter, she left one final instruction. She asked the attorney to make sure a copy of that letter was shown to every single relative who had contested the will, not to punish them, but so no one misunderstands my silence. And that's when everything basically blew up again, because within days, people who had already accepted the outcome suddenly found out there was more, and the reactions were immediate. Melissa said it was unnecessary and cruel. Derek said it proved the whole thing had been planned against them, and other relatives started arguing all over again. But this time it didn't feel like a fight about money anymore. It felt like people realizing they had already been judged long before the will was ever read. And the worst part for them wasn't even the inheritance anymore. It was the fact that Grandma had been paying attention the entire time without saying a word. And she had written it all down in a way nobody could argue with. After that, things slowly started fading out. People stopped showing up uninvited, the group chat went quiet for good, and the family didn't magically fix itself. It just rearranged itself around the truth. And me? I just stayed in the house she left behind. Not because it felt like a win, but because for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like I was taking care of someone out of obligation. It felt like I was just continuing something she already knew I would keep doing. And every now and then I still think about how loud everyone got when they thought they were entitled to her story, and how quiet it got when they realized she had already told it herself in the only way that actually mattered.